Untitled la famille.
Thank you all. How are you? You can share the two mics for the three of you. So what I like with this panel is that you all work within the tech press scene in Europe or with the tech press scene, but you're all at different sides of the spectrum, so you have different perspectives on things. I guess the first topic that I wanted to raise is about this boom of the European startups in the last years has shaped the way the media cover them, and we've seen new media being launched, we've seen traditional media suddenly covering the startup scene. What's your perspective on that? What do you think of the startup press scene in Europe right now? And do you think we've, reached a peak? Do you expect even more media being launched? What's up with that?
Well, Sifted's just going to dominate the whole landscape, so we don't need any other ones.
Obviously.
No, but seriously, obviously, it's a super interesting area to cover. It's hopefully this whole ecosystem is only going to grow, so we kind of need more and more press to kind of really understand it and report on it and share useful information about it, I think.
Guillaume, what do you think of this new tech press ecosystem?
It's getting bigger, of course. Honestly, there is no subject like the tech scene that attracted more interest from inside a newspaper. I work at Les Echos, so Les Echos is very general, and there is no subject at all since 10 or 15 years that attracted so much excitement. And I think it's a good thing for the ecosystem, and it's going to attract more journalists to cover it, and maybe more media to be built.
Sure, because you now have this dedicated full page in Les Echos for the last 4 years now?
Yeah, so 3.5 years. And at the very beginning, we started to see companies going into the news, and we never talked about them before that because we are organized in sectors. And to talk about Uber, for example, most of the big companies, French companies who had bigger turnover were attracting the light, and then we were missing something. So we started to do these fully daily pages.
And all the journalists want to work for your Les Echos startup, I guess.
Not all of them. A lot of journalists actually says that inside Les Echos said we are the good news section, and we're going to tend to. That is going to change. Maybe we're going to talk about that, but it's going to change in the next couple of years, I think.
Interesting. Joanna, from your own perspective, is it easier to work for the startup industry right now because there are so many more media and journalists covering it?
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say there are many more media, specialized media that were actually built just a few years ago or very recently and are built around tech and around this ecosystem. And I find that's really interesting, and they're very diversified too. And we get also media that try and go really more into depth and talk about other stuff than raising funds but go into really more detail. And for media such as Les Echos, I remember a few years back when we used to contact maybe one journalist who was trying to deal with all the tech. And this is very much changed now and is much more adapted, and there's some really, really cool things that are being built, even if the teams are really, I think, probably very much in demand from a point of view because there's so much going on. But I think it's really interesting also to see the way that generalist media have reorganized their teams, and that I think that even in other sectors than tech, anything environmental or, you'll always have a more and more understanding of tech issues, and it's getting really interesting, yeah.
And speaking of the tech issues, I like the positioning of Sifted, tell the untold stories, right? What was the rationale behind launching such a media for the Financial Times? What was the rationale behind it?
So the Financial Times at the moment only covers businesses when they are pretty enormous already. And obviously there's this whole ecosystem below, 1 million a year turnover, 100 million a year turnover. So the founder of Sifted, who's the innovation editor of the Financial Times, just sort of saw this opportunity to cover all of these stories. And also, we only cover startups in Europe, startup and tech in Europe, and that's because we think Europe works differently from the rest of the world. It's very different from Silicon Valley, and it's different from China. And this constant comparison of kind of, here's what's going on in Silicon Valley, and here's poor little Europe raising way less money, doing things slower, is not really an accurate portrayal. It's not very helpful, and it's like a bit boring now to keep hearing that same narrative. So we want to offer something a bit fresh.
Yeah. All right. So it makes me think about, obviously, the hot topic of the moment is the boom of the European fundraisings. And Joanna, I'm sure you know this figure much better than I do, but the latest Atomico report about the state of the European tech showed that last year, the level of investments in European startups reached 20 billion euros, which is more than 4 times the level of investments in 2013. So obviously it has an impact on how the media cover them, and it has consequences on the media attention for fundraisings. And from my experience, when founders from the family would come to me and they want to announce a fundraising, especially for the founders who announced a very successful, I don't know, Series A or Series B 3 years ago, they expect the same level of media coverage they had. And I have to educate them a lot on how the media ecosystem changed, and they might not get the same level of media coverage for fundraising announcements. So I want to know all your perspective on that. How do you decide to relay fundraising or not? Is it just a question of amount raised? What has changed? Guillaume, I'm sure you have an opinion on that.
Honestly, if you don't raise at least 50 million, you're not sure of having a cover.
50 million.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, just because of the amount of fundraising that occurred, there's just too many. So if we talk about fundraising, it has to be like this. You have to understand when me or my colleague are going to the meeting room to sell the subject to the chief editors, we have to say something sexy. And fundraising is not sexy anymore. So we have to say something else, we have to find other stories, and unless, again, if you raised 70 million, 150 million like Dr. Lieb and you become a unicorn, and we only have 3 unicorns in France, then yes, it's a big story.
You have a story.
Yeah, other than that, you have to find something else. But you can say that if you raise like 5 million, you can still be covered, but you have to find something else to say.
Yeah, what's behind and how the business changed, I guess, and what is really the vision of the startup.
Yeah, something like that. And how do you attack your market? Who's your main competitor, and why you're so different? And maybe and give. I mean, if I could say something, maybe give few key figures, because there's a big lack of figures, and at Leseco we love figures and numbers. So yes, you have to give a little something.
That's also definitely a topic I wanna tackle, the data thing. But so, Joanna, what's your perspective on the fundraising? Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'll move even further from what you were saying. I say some of the best stories I think that I've actually worked on were very small amounts that were raised, and they had really, really cool stories around them. And because you have to think differently, because you're going to raise 1 million or 5 million, you do like go into the market, the competitors, the figures, the story, the founders, and you go and like pull on the real stuff, really. So I think that there were very cool stories that have been made like that. It's not because you're raising money that you have a story, basically.
You will get covered.
Yes, yeah.
Amy, do you cover fundraising at Sifted?
So right from the start, we kind of said fundraising stories are really boring. We're not going to cover them. And then we kind of figured actually people they want to at least know that one has happened, like to not have missed one. So we now have a section of our newsletter which goes out 3 times a week where I'll put in fundraising stories, and it is me picking them. So, and I don't put them all in because we've never said we're comprehensive coverage of fundraisings. If all you like is fundraising, read TechCrunch. Like they kind of got that. But if you want more than that, read us. So criteria for me is kind of, if it's really big, then obviously it goes in. If it ties into a kind of narrative, so if I'm like, this is the 20th scooter company to have raised money in a week, I'm like, something going on here, so let's cover this. If it's really random and really small and the person hasn't pitched it to me with an interesting angle, or I kind of can't see any broader relevance, then sorry, but you're one of like 50 startups to have raised $1 million this week, probably. Those numbers might be a bit off, but you get the idea.
Okay. All right, so if founders can't rely on fundraising to be vocal about their startups anymore, I guess I have the $1 billion question for you. What makes a good story? What do you think is a good story, Amy?
People are normally a good place to start. Yeah. Probably my number one bugbear with pitches, and by the way, I very rarely run a story based on a pitch that's come into me by email. That's not really the way I work. Is when people assume I understand something, and especially if it's really tricky technology, if I don't understand it, I'm just gonna definitely discard that email. So never assume anyone knows anything, has heard of you before. You need to work hard to explain to people why you're interesting, your company's interesting, this particular story you're selling me, and you need to sell an angle. I also get a lot of emails that are like, hey, I'm working on this, no explanation. Want to meet for a coffee? And I'm like, no, I haven't got that much spare time. Come on, why? So the thing I always say is, unless you can explain what you do and why you're interesting in a way that your grandma or your friend down the pub who doesn't work in startups would understand, then there's absolutely no reason why a journalist would find it interesting either.
And so, Joanna, you've been in this industry for years. I'm sure you have plenty of, takeaways from all this experience.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think that media and journalists don't work in the same way. So you're going to have to think first, if you're looking to work on a story, who your audience is. And if you get that, and if you know that you have one type of audience or several types of audiences, you'll be able to prepare and to build a story maybe in one or maybe in several different ways, or maybe in actually a different way according to each journalist. So that's the first thing that I would say. And then I think that in general, the feedback that I have is the interest will be what makes you different. Why are you doing what you're doing? Explain in a very specific way why you're contacting the journalist, what stage you are at and what you expect. And in that way, in a very short way of communicating, whether it be email or social media or face-to-face, I think that it makes it much easier for a media and a journalist to respond, I think. But so those are some takeaways. Some of the best stories that I think I worked on are very human stories. So there'll be actually a very specific story linked to or kind of anecdote or something that will either get you into a more general context, and it will be the right time and the right moment, or will just make the difference. And also, I think I'd add, is if you're flexible on the timing and actually know what type of constraints a media or a journalist can have, that makes it much easier also. If you say, our timing is according to you, basically, that also, I think, is helpful.
I'd really agree on that. I think if you're an enormous news organisation, and I don't know how it works at Les Echos, but if you're a really big news desk, you'll have heaps of reporters who, if something really interesting comes in, you can give it to one of them. We have 5 journalists at Sifted. If you send me a press release and it is absolutely super interesting and for whatever reason we really want to cover it, but it needs to go live tomorrow, I've probably got 2 interviews already lined up that day, and I need to write a newsletter, and I'm speaking on a panel in the evening, and you know what? I haven't got time to do justice to that story, so I won't do it. But if someone had given me that press release, or that, you know, gave me advance warning that this really super interesting partnership they were announcing, and they could give me all of the background into how that partnership came about and what they'd learned from that and how they'd mucked it up in various ways and why they thought this was really revolutionary for the industry, I could write a really interesting piece on that given enough time. So I think people are sometimes missing opportunities because they're not being flexible enough. So I think that's super important to think. And you can normally trust journalists if you say, you know, this is under embargo, do not tell anyone about this until this particular date. Like, if they're a good journalist, they stick to that. You don't need to worry about that.
Normally.
Yeah. Normally.
To answer your question, Maud, 2 types of news are interesting to me. One is prepared news, like you have a launch, you have a fundraising, you have a new product, whatever, and the unprepared news. And we never talk about that, but you're gonna have to, you're gonna fail at some point. You can be sued by someone. You can have many problems, and that's where we're gonna cover this also. And so to me, those are the 2 types of news that we need to address that are really relevant to us. And to go back to the first one, when you prep a news, the first thing is I want to know that the story will be able and will be available only at Les Echos in France. Because if you tell me, oh, it's an embargo and we're going to shoot the press release that day and everybody's going to know this and write the same thing, I'm not interested.
So you want the exclusivity all the time for all the important news?
Exclusivity or something, or I can have access to something that only our readers can have access to. Okay.
You said something interesting about the fails of some startups or of the founders, and it relates also to what you said, Joanna, about some anecdotes that we can tell also the journalists. A lot of founders are afraid to tell their whole story because it may be damaging their brand. They would be afraid of the consequences if they tell the world what went wrong at some point. But actually, do you think we should be more vocal about what went wrong and the fails of some founders? I mean, in the process, in the lifetime of a startup. Would you cover that?
I would say that don't try to lie or hide anything, because that's our job to know where is the truth. And sometimes we miss it, but sometimes we find it. And there's nothing worse than someone who's not telling you the truth or is trying to hide something. So yeah, it's very important to be open and transparent about your story, especially. Then, of course, about the figures of your company and everything, that's more tricky. But I think the better relationship that I have with the startups are the ones that I could share a lot, and I could talk to them outside the news circle also.
That are based on trust and
Yeah.
And would you cover a story if you receive a pitch about a fail, something that went wrong at a startup? Would you cover them if it's interesting?
People love hearing about failure, like so much, because failure comes. There's an element of kind of, oh, thank God I'm not the only one who gets all these things wrong, which people like reading. But there's real learnings in that. No one really likes to read a story that's like, here's me. I had this amazing idea, it all went really well, I raised all this money, and now, hey, look, I'm killing it. Like, that's not very interesting. People want to hear about the kind of up and down and up and down. And I think also on the transparency point, that goes beyond just a journalist is going to do their homework and they might find out whatever you're not telling them anyway, and then you look bad because you haven't said it. It's also, a lot of startups, they make their brand about transparency. And it works. It works for getting employees. It works for getting customers. I don't know quite so much about investors, but it certainly gets you attention, and that's kind of how investors come to you. So I think basically, I think transparency is never a bad thing, and I actually think it reflects really well on the company, on the founder, and has this kind of ripple effect, which is generally quite positive.
Yeah. And do you have any other do's and don'ts that you want to share with founders whenever they want to pitch a story?
So I said about explaining really clearly what you do. I also mentioned that I rarely write stories on the back of pitches. So it's best just to build a relationship with a journalist, get to know them, come to events, grab them afterwards, email, Twitter, whatever, just get to know them, because that's where the most natural stories come from. And if we've already discussed that this kind of like fundraising cycle of news is not really of interest, the more kind of you open yourself and your company up to a journalist, the more they can kind of find what they think is interesting and tie that into other stuff that they're noticing. And I think it's a time investment, so you need to kind of pick the journalist you bother to do that with, but over time I think that reaps lots of rewards.
Yeah. I like that, like letting the journalist find by themselves what's the right angle and what's actually interesting within the startup.
Yeah, I would add to that. I'd say the story is not actually always the one you want it to be. And I'd say as a founder or as a PR, we're here to maybe help journalists in making things as clear as possible, bring the right figures, make things clear, but then the story and the angle, it's no longer about us, basically. We can suggest things, but that's as far as it goes. So, and also about relationships, I think that's really important when everything's positive and you have cool stuff to talk about, but especially when things get a bit touchy and a bit rocky. That's also, I think, incredibly important, because you actually have somebody there that knows you, knows the company to interact with. And also, some advice that I give is, I would full on give the advice to be transparent and to never lie, that's for sure. If you are not certain of an answer, or if you don't remember a figure or something, don't hesitate to say, wait, just a few seconds, or after the interview, I'll just check this up and send you up a follow-up email. So you don't leave the interview and say, oh, I'm not really sure about what I just said there. So I would say that, I think, is probably a tip I would give.
Definitely, that's a really good reminder.
One of the things that I wanted to mention is try to be available. Like I have a story, I can't tell you the names, but maybe you can figure them out. But a few weeks ago, we did a story and we portrayed few people. And we contacted one of these people because we wanted to portray it because they were relevant to our angle of the story. And the PR said, "Oh, that's not on our agenda. We don't want to appear on this type of thing, and they want to do that." And that's not good. Honestly, as a journalist, you don't want to hear that, and you're going to do it anyway. So try to be available when it's when we
show
ask
some
you something.
openness.
Yes.
Yeah. Whenever journalists reach out to you. You mentioned something about the data earlier. How much of the PR data driven stories are of interest to you? Do you wish you would receive more pitches based on data and facts and figures from startups? Is that an issue you have?
Oh yeah, I mean, I receive, like probably you guys, like almost 300 emails every day.
300 per day? Okay.
Yeah. So if you want to catch the attention, if you put a figure out there, that's going to be relevant and it's very efficiency. So
what type of figures are you
it can be
for?
the market share, it can be turnover, it can be number of customers, anything that I can catch on, and then we can develop later on. But something that really pops you out of the noise, this big noise. And not a lot of startups are sharing figures, and you don't necessarily have to share all the figures, but at least a couple, so we can hang on something.
Whoa,
I just hit my teeth. The other thing that I think with startups, how they work differently from other companies and that is interesting for the press is the more like internal figures. So I tweeted about this earlier this week, like how many female developers do you have? If you've got a good ratio, like tell people about that, explain how you managed to get there. So there's a lot of internal numbers or like clever things you can do with obviously like GDPR compliant, but about your customer data. You can do kind of fun stories about, say you're a delivery company, like they all do this anyway, but like what kind of things people like ordering on a Friday or on Valentine's Day, what's the most common thing? You know, you can build narratives around that stuff as well that's maybe a bit more, has a bit of a broader like audience interest than some of the more kind of financial numbers sometimes.
Definitely. And Joanna, so I have a more PR people related question. But speaking of data, how do you deal with the request for a strict ROI from your clients? Because most of the founders, they want to, if they invest in PR, that's what they think. They want ROI and they want, to get some results. It has been a long, very, very long debate in the PR world for years. How do you deal with that?
I deal with that by being very, very transparent from the beginning. I know more or less if it's going to be, what the possibilities will be, according to when I will discuss with a founder or a PR person on the client side. I will ask as many questions as I can on the context and what figures they have, what they want to share. In some cases, I will not advise we work together. Maybe there's some things that they can do on their own, or maybe it's not the right moment, or maybe I'm not the right person. But if I do think that I can help them, I will be extremely clear on the expectations with no guarantee. But the only result, I think, is for them to get through to the audience that they would like to, with the message that they would like to have. But this is also a discussion. If they have expectations, or if they have the certain messages that I think will not fit or will not be interesting for the media and for the audience, the best advice that I can give is to be very, very clear from day one. And then there's if you give very precise expectations and you go beyond, it's a good thing.
And do you also sometimes recommend founders to not do PR at all? And do you actually think that...
A lot.
A lot, okay.
Yeah, I do, definitely. There in many cases, it's not necessary to do PR. And in certain cases, it's good to do PR, but in a very precise time of development. And in other cases, it's good to build PR awareness. So I think that there are three big categories. And when I do advise not to work with a PR or an agency, what I do try and share is the way that they can start thinking of the next steps, like identifying the media that they themselves read, that their audience reads, the journalists that they find interesting, see what they cover, how they cover it. There's a lot of identifying who your ecosystem is. And a lot can be done on your own, really a lot.
And I mean, from my side, a lot of founders would want to do PR first because they want to get more customer acquisition. And I tend to tell them, well, if your only goal is to get more customers, maybe PR is not the solution for you. So yes, being also very clear on what are the expectations really, because PR doesn't suit all the objectives, all the goals for a founder. Amy, you mentioned a tweet that you did earlier this week, and I want to tackle the issue of diversity in tech and how the press and PR people have a role into this whole issue. How much when you're running stories, how much of that issue do you have in mind? Do you feel like you have a responsibility to showcase more diversity in the stories that you make public? Do you have that on your mind? Is that something that is way more just present in the last maybe years than 10 years ago, I guess?
I don't know about 10 years ago, but right now, if you, yes, to answer your question, it's very, very important. And if I meet 3 founders of a startups that looks like me, I'm gonna tend to walk away a little bit because I know what they're gonna talk to me about, how they're gonna address the market, and maybe the habits. What I'm seeking of is something different. And we all look at something different, a different story, different angle, different narrative. And that cannot happen with the same type of people that you're gonna interview. So if you have a female co-owner, co-founder, or CTO, or someone from the minority, or whatever the difference is, please, put it out there and let us interview her.
I think it's absolutely the media's responsibility, but it's also companies' responsibility. So when people kind of say, oh, there just aren't any female founders, or oh, there just aren't any female coders, it's like, there are, you're just not looking hard enough. And you can, and we did with Sifted from the very beginning, have a very conscious decision, like, we're not going to have our homepage ever, and this isn't about looks, it's just an easy way to kind of quantify it, with like 3 photos of like a white male founder. Like, if we're doing that, we're doing something really wrong. And okay, there are way, way, way fewer female founders than male founders, so don't just speak to founders. Like, find other people on the team. Don't just write stories where the only people you want to speak to, insist on speaking to the founder. If a company's big, then, like, in all likelihood, the founder doesn't really know what's going on with certain departments. So speak to the person who's head of that department, who, hey, might be a person of colour, or might have come from a very different background to the founder. And that's how you kind of bring in diversity of viewpoints and perspectives and opinions, which is the important thing at the end of the day, and that actually normally just comes with diversity of people. So I think it's both ways. Like, the journalist can be quite conscious of that. I in the past have said, no, I don't want to interview your CEO, I want to interview your head of marketing, because I was writing a piece about advertising and she happened to be a woman, so I was like, great. So you can do that, you can actively do that as a journalist, and you as companies can also put forward different people.
Joanna, I'm sure you have a perspective on that because you've been involved in the issue for years.
Yeah, I think it's essential. I think it's not even I hope that one day we won't even be talking in these terms. But I think that since the past maybe 5 years, we're well beyond just saying, there's a lack of diversity, but there are many journalists that are very sensitive to the subject and that we, with Start Her or even TechFugees, work with, and who've done an absolutely essential job on highlighting diverse profiles. And I think there's, in some cases, it seems abnormal to have an article in which only male people are quoted, and there is a kind of very good dynamic between PRs and journalists who know the importance of this. And I think that there is a responsibility on both sides to try and work as much as possible on this. And yes, not only interviewing the CEOs or the founders, I think that also is a good start.
All right. Guillaume, how do you have an overview of the stories that work the better at Les Echos Startups? Do you have, the number of clicks per article, or how does it work? Because it's something that we don't know. We don't know how it works behind.
It's secret sauce.
Yes.
No, we switched the model of Les Echos a few years ago. And so now we're more on a subscriber-based model. So fortunately, because otherwise you're getting crazy at trying to get the most readers and the most click, and it's just a total nightmare as a journalist also, because it puts you away from the good stories, I think. But at the same time, you have to know what your audience wants, and because you're writing for them. So we do look at the metrics of an article online. We also look closer on the sharing point, like LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever, and that gives you a trend, and then you can use that trend to address other subjects, to go deeper on the subject. That's how we use it. Yeah.
So you look at the figures, but you try to stay away from being only influenced by the number of clicks.
You can't do that. I mean, you just become crazy, I think. And secondly, you're going to miss the good story.
Okay.
Because the good story, it starts with a small detail that nobody sees and nobody's going to take care of. And nobody gives a shit, to be honest. And if you don't do that, then you're going to miss the good story. So, yeah.
Okay. How do you cope with that at Sifted?
Well, we're still super early, so we're figuring it out, but it's more, we'll pay attention to stories that get really, really well shared or get lots of clicks, and look more at, do we think it was the sector? Do we think it was that particular company? Do we think it was the format? And often I think it's to do with the format. So we've done these kind of comparison pieces of like, what really is the difference between all the digital banks? What really is the difference between all the scooter companies? And that just came from us in the office being like, wait a second, which one's that again? And thinking, if we're doing that and we're really tied into this ecosystem, other people are as well. And those ones have got heaps of organic traffic, so people are actually, they are searching for this stuff. So we've taken that formula and want to do that for more and more industries. And then another thing is the kind of personal stories, the failure, or we've been writing about mental health, for example. Those stories do really well. So a learning from that we've taken is just kind of the personal stories of a founder or a person who works in a company's journey people are interested in. And another thing we've noticed is just the kind of very practical how to do something. So how I did a piece, and Maud was in it, on how to PR your startup, another one on how to hire people. So just finding people who we know are experts. And again, this is a great one for kind of diverse, kind of just getting different people who aren't usually maybe spokespeople in, and just kind of milking them for their expertise on one very specific thing. People really like those. So I don't think that's too it's not like becoming clickbait. It's just we've learned kind of particular areas people want to know or learn more about, and then we're just trying out more of them.
And I'm being curious now, what are the sectors that attract the more viewers, readers?
Fintech.
Fintech, okay.
If all you want is clicks, just write about fintech. Like, literally, just put like Monzo or TransferWise or N26 in a headline, and everyone will click on it.
Do you think it's very UK, like a UK audience mainly? Guillaume, would you say that the French readers of Les Echos are mostly attracted to fintech-related topics?
Yeah, fintech is a hot topic, but one of the other topics that is really booming is blockchain. I mean, it's a shame a little bit because nobody really understands what's going on, and they all click or write about it, and it's kind
Maybe
of
they
odd.
try to understand what's going on.
Yeah, but every time you put blockchain on an article, that's booming. So it's transsectorial, I would say. Mobility, we were talking about it prior to this event, and mobility is a big driver also.
I think it's things where, I think the reason people are super interested in fintech or in mobility, or I guess in blockchain as well, is because we as consumers are hearing about these things, or like literally seeing them on our streets, or like seeing people paying for things with these like bright coloured bank cards. So it's wider than just people who work in startups, whereas like SaaS stuff, like maybe you just wouldn't come across it otherwise. So it just has this much wider audience, which is I think where it builds this kind of like hype around it.
And other things, it's not a sector, but one thing that really attracts our readers is a portrait. So when we write an in-depth portrait of someone, usually it really works well. So that tells you the appetite for stories and to understand someone a little better. So I can name her because she's great. I did a portrait on the Marie Eklund a few months ago.
It was great.
And really, we had a lot of feedback on her. And I think it's a good thing. So it doesn't necessarily say that we're going to do a lot of portraits because you have to have a deep story and a lot of things to say. But at some point, it can be interesting to feed the journalist and us with your point of view on something and what you're doing on the side and why you're doing it, your motivation, etc. Because at some point, you're going to, again, pop up from the noise.
Can people pitch you a portrait, or is it weird? Can you do my portrait, please?
Yeah, it can happen. I mean, recently I missed out the founder of Canva. She's from Australia. She just raised 70 million and for 2.5 billion valuation. Honestly, I didn't know her. She's great, Melanie Perkins. And I met her at Vivatech last week. And it was great. I mean, I didn't write the portrait yet, and maybe I will down the road, but she could have, the PR team around her could have suggested it.
Okay, interesting. I wanted to tell you about a struggle that I have. It's the way journalists and PR people work together. And because when I started to do PR, I was very much shocked by how the whole work relationship was stuck into the old model of sending emails, chasing at journalists, doing follow-up calls, and it's like there is no digital transition for the PR and press industry. What's your stance? How can we just improve the whole thing? Because you were saying you received 300 emails per day. That's insane.
That's insane. And I would say the only thing, try to make it as frictionless. Like you build products, and one of the things that I hear the most frequently is we think about the user experience. We try to make it no friction at all. So please do the same for us. No friction. So no phone calls on the cell phone at 10 p.m. or
People do that?
Yeah, they do that. They send you a text message on a Sunday like, have you read the email that I've sent you yesterday? No, I didn't, and I might not because you just pain in the ass right now. So yeah, try to think as just a human relationship, and
just be human, please.
Yeah.
I think that's excellent advice. Like, when in any other normal human relationship do you ever email someone, email them the next day, then try and call them, then email them and say, I just tried to call you, did you see my email? And you're like, haven't you taken the bloody hint? Like, I am not interested, and now we are definitely not friends, and I am going to block your number. Like, it completely perplexes me as well. Like, it is not moved into the modern era of communication or relationship building.
Yeah. What about the press release? Same, it's an old thing. Does it still matter to write press release, to send press release to journalists? Is it really the type of format that you want to work with?
I think the press release is useful just as a source, like a chunk of information in one go. But equally, you can have, I think, a really good piece of advice is to have a very, very obvious press section on your website. So press contact, like ideally a specific person's email, or like press at. Like, so often I have to email like info at, and it's again this friction point. It's just making the chances of that story happening even less. Having images of founders, team, product. If your product is like weird and hard to understand, maybe some illustrations. Like, just think, if I'm writing a story about you and for some reason, I'm not sure why, I might not even have contacted you, but you want me to be able to get as much accurate information as possible from your website without even needing to contact you. Have a nice, beautiful photo, so maybe you appear higher up in the piece or something. So that's one thing. And then, I mean, if it's all there already, but the press release, you can kind of pull out a few numbers up-to-date figures, when it was founded, how much you've raised to date, who the founders are, how big the team is, all that kind of stuff in a useful chunk. But it could just be in an email.
And do you use these new tools made for journalists and PR people, such as journal requests, Cision, Haro on Cision, Babbler, all these new tools that tried to change the whole dynamics, but it seems like in France it's not really getting anywhere.
I personally don't use it. I'm not saying it's not relevant to a certain type of journalist, maybe, but we have the luxury of being comment dire, a lot of people contact us, so we don't necessarily use this tool. But it depends on what target are you aiming with speaking to a journalist. If you want to talk to someone in a specific industry that has a very little magazine that talks about it, but it is really well known, then it's good, because they won't identify you otherwise. So I would say yes, but for us, no.
Neither. Okay, interesting. And you, same. See, it's not working. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how to crack that.
Maybe it could be useful in certain cases, maybe more for B2C. Maybe, but I don't use that either. I think you lose a lot of the impact, and you maybe have a chance of being a bit more annoying to a journalist if you really don't target them. I mean, I think the best thing probably would be to put yourselves in the shoes of a journalist and imagine yourself receiving 300 emails a day, and imagine that you have a small window of attention, and just do your best at, using that in a good way.
And one of the things, because we're talking about digital, but being journalist, I think we would say the same thing or maybe different, but I do this job because I love meeting people. I love to interact. So digitalize everything is like makes me more crazy, and it's like what the world we're living in. I need to meet the people. I need to see their eye when they talk to me about their company or their product. I need to see if they feel it, if they're under it, if they believe in it. How what's the driver? You don't see that on an email or anything like that.
I think when you meet someone in person, no one else is meeting that person and having that exact same conversation as you were having then. And journalists, we're really vain. We really want to write a story that no one else has written, or we want to describe a person in a different way, or piece some things together in a way other people have. And I think the best way of kind of allowing the journalists to do their thing is to give them the biggest access, be transparent, and meet them in person and build that relationship. And just like interacting with them digitally it never has that like depth, or you kind of forget about people way more easily.
Thanks for all the feedback. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks to the amazing panelists that we were welcoming today. So see you around.
Que la famille.